So a simple yes could change the course of history and the world's maps. Scots are voting today on whether to sever their 300-year-old ties with England and break up the United Kingdom. Citizens are answering the question, should Scotland be an independent country? Opinion polls suggest the no vote could still take it by a slim margin, but the country was almost split heading into this referendum today. If Scotland votes for independence, the United Kingdom, which is made up of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, will lose a third of its territory and more than 8% of its citizens. So what is at stake economically for the region and international economic relations? Well, here's a look at Scotland's gross domestic product relative to its current place in the UK. Most of the North Sea oil reserves are in Scottish waters, but oil revenue reportedly on the decline. If oil revenues are included in GDP figures, Scotland is shown to generate more per head of population than the UK as a whole. But if you do not include oil and gas revenues, then there's little difference in those figures. So there you see on your screen voting underway in Scotland at the moment. Independent supporters say it's time for Scotland to make its own leaders, to choose its own leaders rather, and make its own decisions. But opponents say it could spell economic gloom. Scotland's economy is estimated to be about 1/10 of the size of the rest of Britain. Its share of UK debt, though, the equivalent of 90% of its total output or GDP. The Royal Bank of Scotland and Llyoys, as well as other big banks and businesses, have threatened to relocate south, where the majority of their business is done. Scotland, historically more left-leaning, and a former Scottish Nationalist party leader has said that the major banks should be nationalised. Well, to discuss, let's cross to London. We're joined on the line by an associate fellow from Chatham House and a former official at the Bank of England, John Nugee. John, thank you so much for joining us. So which way do you want the vote to go? Which way do you think it will go?
That's a very difficult question to ask an Englishman. The vote has been very carefully drawn to only be answered by Scots, and an Englishman should not opine, particularly not today when the polls are still open. As to how I think it will go, I have to side with the majority of polls and say that the no vote is most likely to win narrowly. Of course, what that means is if the vote is yes, it will be more of a surprise to markets. If the vote is yes, it sounds quite alarming from some quarters. Credit Suisse talking about a deep recession in Scotland. Just talk about what you think the consequences would be. I think both sides have overplayed what will happen. Obviously, the yes side wanted to post a very positive picture of an independent Scotland. The no campaign has played very much on economic fears. I think it's important, as you said in your introduction, to realise that Scotland is very similar to England. Absent North Sea oil, it's extremely similar, and that the two are going to remain major trading partners, whatever. So long-term, there's no reason why Scotland should not prosper. That doesn't mean short-term there will be considerable disruptions, and you mentioned a recession. I think that would be relatively difficult to avoid, as governments, both sides of a new border, concentrated more on the political aspects of separation than the economic aspect of running economies.
So some people are saying that there's this irony. The Scots haven't enjoyed austerity measures, but perhaps if this vote goes the yes way, there will be even more austerity needed, or the government will have to raise taxes. What do you think the short-term effects will be?
I think the short-term effects will be a shock to the market. Possibly sterling would fall further. When the first poll came out showing a very close race, sterling fell quite sharply against the dollar, against the euro, and I think it would fall further again. I think shares in Scottish industries, Scottish companies, would also suffer a bit. Economically, the Scottish government would not be separate and would not have separate control of its taxes for at least 18 months. So for the moment, the United Kingdom government in London would maintain the tax support that London offers Scotland.
How much, from businesses' perspective, do you think, John, is posturing? A lot of talk of leaving Scotland. Surely they could stay and do business south of the border. Surely that's an extreme reaction, or could there be an exodus?
I need to distinguish between financial business and other business. Let me first say that other business in Scotland is not just a finance and oil country. The other business in Scotland will stay there, and there's no reason why it shouldn't prosper in doing so. The financial business in Edinburgh, which is substantial, I think would need to look at its location for two reasons. Firstly, 90% of their British customers are covered by London regulation, and it would be quite challenging for them to adapt to new regulation from a new Edinburgh government. But the second thing is that the Scottish financial system is very, very large compared to Scottish GDP. It's about the banking system is about 12 times GDP, and that is very dangerous for a small country. We saw Iceland go bust with a banking system 10 times its GDP. Ireland suffer huge problems with a banking system 5 times its GDP. So I think the headquarters will move almost inevitably for regulatory reasons. I think many of the jobs will stay in Scotland.
Well, that brings me to the other question. Financial services strong. What about the other sectors in Scotland, barring oil, which is seen as a panacea, and is it?
I think oil is a declining asset, but they have one other liquid which I enjoy enormously, which is whiskey. Actually, the whiskey industry...
I forgot about that. Thank you.
The whiskey industry generates at least half as much as the oil industry, and more importantly, is growing.
Wow.
And it's such a good brand, too, because it's a luxury brand. It represents the country at its best. Scotland has a very fine tourist industry. It has considerable other light engineering, heavy engineering industries. It's by no means just oil and finance.
Okay, that is good news for the Scots. The final contentious issue, let's deal with that. Scotland would like to keep the pound. England's saying by no means. What do you think will play out there? I guess England already feeling the effects on its currency right now.
That, I think, is partly posturing. Mr. Salmond, the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, would say it's wholly posturing. There is a challenge. If you have a full monetary union, you do have to obey the financial policies of the larger member. In your part of the world, the Rand monetary area, the Swazi government, the Lesotho government, the Namibia government have to obey what the government in Pretoria and the Reserve Bank say. Now, for Scotland just becoming independent, that would be more of a challenge. I think in the end they will be better off with their own currency. It enables them to build a banking system. It enables them to build a capital market. It enables them to escape from English-determined exchange rates and English-determined interest rates.
All right, thank you so much for your analysis. Joining us from London there, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, John Nugee.